Hey everybody, and welcome to a special sort of episode of An Episode of Astartes. This is going to be the first episode of Bad Guys of 40K. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you missed the other video. It's going to be the first link in the comments down below. Hazel and I are here today, though, to talk to you about my favorite bad guy of the 40K universe, Konrad Curze. Before we get started, of course, I want to remind everyone to please like and subscribe, and consider clicking on the link down below for the Buy Me a Coffee. We are about a year into this project and really trying to move forward and come up with new content like this for you, which takes a lot more time and effort to go into. And there are monthly costs associated with doing this anyway, on top of the time and effort that it takes out of my schedule to do it. I really enjoy doing it, and I would like to continue it forever if I can. But your support would make that even more possible. And now, without further ado, the first episode of the Bad Guys of Warhammer, which we are going to call Konrad Curze is a good bad guy, or maybe a bad bad guy, or maybe a bad guy with a bad dad guy. Yeah, I don't love it either. So if you weren't aware, this is going to be a series in which I kind of talk about some of my favorite villains of the 40K universe, and then I also talk a little bit about how we might decide to relate to them or think about them, the actions that they've committed, and to judge them using terms from our world and whatever. So there's going to be some terms that we're going to be using today. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about free will versus predestination, and we're going to be touching on utilitarianism as well, which is a philosophy that talks about accomplishing the most good, the least amount of pain, or the most amount of happiness possible for as many people as possible. So to talk about Konrad Curze, just a little bit of a cliff notes on him. Konrad Curze is one of the 18 Primarchs of the story. So like all the other Primarchs, he is dumped out across the universe, and for Curze, that means ending up on a far-off planet known as Nostromo. There, he is entirely alone, and he is forced to fight for every bit of everything by himself. He finds himself up against this monstrous autocracy, which is controlled by a ruling elite, which basically just controls all industry on the planet, mostly, and most notably, very rich mineral reserves in the core. So everyone else ends up scrapping for and fighting for whatever they can on a planet that is essentially eternally in night. Everyone is fighting against crazy gangs on the streets, except for, like I said, the richest of the rich, which control it all. And that is the world that Konrad Curze is born into, and that is the world that begins to shape his morality. While Konrad Curze is living in a place where pretty much everyone he comes into contact with is suffering and dying, sometimes now because of the Night Haunter's own hand, he has taken it upon himself to become the avenger of all wrongs that he sees, and on a planet like this, there's plenty of wrongs. Meanwhile, back on Terra, interestingly enough, the Night Lord Legion is being formed, and what will become the modern Night Lords really coincidentally feel very similar and at home to what's going on Nostromo. So it's really interesting to me that basically the Night Lord's Legion is taken from the stock of criminals who also are found and pulled out of prisons deep under the earth. Like, there's so much similarity here and so much going on, and eventually when Konrad Curze meets up with his Legion, their first connection goes really, really well, because quite honestly, there's so much philosophically in common with experiences and background. While it's not really easy to make this stick with evidence, and it's kind of hard for me to find any sort of specific words of intent for the writers, if we are to take a look at the setting, the fact that the path that Konrad Curze takes and what he is and what he forms out of and the trauma that informs that creation for him, it's really kind of bizarre to me to think about the fact that it matches so well with what's happening back on Earth. And part of the reason that makes me think, and this is maybe the first example of it, this is all part of the Emperor's plan. This is exactly what the Emperor wanted for Konrad Curze, or at least expected to be. Now, the next little puzzle about this whole thing, and one of the really important parts to know about Konrad Curze is, like, he comes from literally nothing. He crawls from the earth. He kills to survive. He develops a sense of justice, which is extremely, extremely brutal, and exacts it across Nostromo. But while this is happening, there are other things that are going on with him as well. On top of his unnatural physical attributes, because he is a Primarch, he has been gifted or cursed with the ability to see the future. Now, this is not the sort of futuristic seeing where he can understand paths and choices and what is to come. It is simply prophecy, the sort of prophecy that always ends up as, a storytelling device in which a character ends up being in a lot of trouble because of what they of what happens to them. This is like the kind of prophecy where someone like finds out about the future, tries not to make it happen, and then somehow it ends up making it actually happen exactly. Now, we're going to skip ahead to the end here a little bit, but Konrad Curze does join with his legion. He is still cursed by these visions, and we all know that he eventually turns traitor and betrays the Emperor. The interesting thing about Curze, and something that's been established as part of his story for a really long time, is the fact that he dies, but not in the heresy. He actually dies after the heresy in, I believe, the era called the Scouring. And he knows and has been able to foresee his death for a very, very long time. And as a matter of fact, there's a quote that really closely represents this, and it gives us a lot to talk about.
Your presence does not surprise me, assassin. I have known of you ever since your craft entered the eastern fringes. Why did I not have you killed? Because your mission and the act that you are about to commit proves the truth of all I have ever said or done. I merely punished those who had wronged, just as your false emperor now seeks to punish me. Death is nothing compared to vindication.
So if you followed the Night Lords for long, you probably heard this quote, and you might have attributed it incorrectly, as I did, at least in my bad memory, to Aaron Dembski-Bowden, who is the author of perhaps one of the most amazing pieces of literature written for Warhammer 40k so far, the Night Lords trilogy. I gotta say something interesting, and in full disclosure here, while it was playing Death Guard in 8th edition that brought me back to the hobby after a break from 5th edition, it was this book that made me remember just how rich this story was, and just how important these stories were. So full props to this, and I always have said, if when you're making those lists of like which are the best Horus Heresy novels, this belongs in the list. I don't care that it's not part of the Horus Heresy series. It tells a great story not only of what's going on in the heresy, but the consequences that happen afterwards, which I think is an important part of that story, at least before the changes that have been made to heresy and the continuity since 8th edition. Interestingly enough, though, this quote did not come from Aaron Dembski-Bowden. This quote actually comes from a series from White Dwarf, I believe. Hold on, let me check. White Dwarf 259 is what I figured out, and that's from August of 2001. Anyway, this was from the Index Astartes articles, where, I don't know about you, but I really, really enjoyed reading those every time. And the Index Astartes articles were these articles where you could hear a little about the story. There were oftentimes little chunks of rule snippets that allowed you to play your Legion in a slightly different way than it was before, just usually force organization alterations or stuff like that. I remember really liking, for example, the version of the rules for the Flesh Tears, which is the first time I had ever heard of them. As well as the Night Lords and all the Legion stuff, basically about the traitor legions, like reading about Chemos for the first time for Fulgrim and the Death Guard and all that. Anyway, the point is that the quote we shared before is actually from that. And so for a very long time, for at least 22 years, this concept has been at the center of the Night Lords mythos. That idea that they were terrible, they committed horrible acts, and at least the Night Haunter himself thought that they were supposed to be like that. This is what was intended for them. So the next thing is for us to talk a little bit about our first terms, which are going to be free will and then determinism. Basically free will, basically saying that you have the ability to choose actions and futures for yourself. Determinism, saying that there is a force that is going to dictate what happens to your life or to actions in general. Now, One of the first examples of this in the concept, you can talk about it in two different ways. The first way is through the idea of religion, with determinism or predestination. Predestination being the fact that the idea that they're God.
Okay, let's have a little moment for clarification here. So, the idea of predestination is inextricably linked with the idea of a divine power for a lot of reasons. One of which is because if you are a person who believes that fate comes from a creator, then that creator has to be part of the discussion. The fact of the matter is, though, that while I've got some approximate knowledge about how these things work, I don't know enough yet to say much about it, much more than just like the smallest bit. So I can tell you that Calvinism, for example, is the most direct example of predestination that I can find, but I've not done the full research to really understand all of that together. And while Christianity in particular does seem to be a pretty influential concept as far as art, design, culture, whatever, to the Warhammer universe, and so it's probably worth at least sort of thinking about in terms of Konrad Curze and some of the other characters, the fact of the matter is that Christianity is just a centralized story for Western culture in general. So one of the things that I tell my students is that you can and do see Christian themes and concepts present in all sorts of Western literature just because of the prevalence of both simultaneously. So I'm not necessarily going to go into more in depth on this as of yet, but I do think a video like that is coming along the way. This is supposed to be educational, and it's not my intent to make anybody feel uncomfortable or awkward when I talk about something, especially if I end up talking about what is your faith. It just seems like some of these things are too closely linked to ignore the connection. But for now, we'll just go back to your typical and expected Ineptus Astartes content with a couple of self-depreciating jokes and then shots of Hazel sticking her head into the frame while she looks for pets.
So free will, and in this case, it's also commonly known as libertarian free will. Oh my God! Utilitarianism in this concept has nothing to do with the political party commonly used in the American politics. Libertarianism is just this belief that individuals have free will, the ability to make choices that are unimpeded by other people. You can make choices, you can make things happen. The concept opposite this is determinism. So in past times and in religious societies or contexts, the deterministic force would be God, perhaps. But it doesn't necessarily have to be, and lots of philosophers who didn't necessarily have religious beliefs or concepts attached to things still had deterministic beliefs. So determinism says that while you choose certain things, you are perhaps unaware of the fact that there are things that have set you towards that concept or choice. So like, for example, this morning for breakfast, I went to Dunkin' Donuts. My wife and I went and grabbed Dunkin' Donuts because it's one of the last days of summer break where I will definitely have mornings free to get things. And we dropped the kids off at their little daycare adventure, and then we came home after getting a snack. Now, we chose to get Dunkin' Donuts, but in reality, we kind of didn't because somebody forgot to go to the store and get more coffee. So I couldn't make coffee this morning. And so while my choice for Dunkin' Donuts was definitely there, right? I definitely had to leave the house because we didn't have any coffee to drink. But at the same time, that wasn't exactly true either because I had a gift card for Dunkin' Donuts. And so I used the gift card to pay for part of it. I did choose to go to Dunkin' Donuts this morning, but it was also the result of me getting a present for helping somebody out with something and the fact that I was too lazy or forgetful in the days previous to go to the grocery store. And so you can get this idea of how determinism says, well, yeah, you choose things, but the choices that you're given, maybe you're confused on just how much choice you actually had. Now, this is interesting, and I think it applies pretty neatly into our situation as well when we're talking about Konrad Curze. I want to introduce one more term or one other philosopher here, and I'm going to butcher this name because I cannot do the French pronunciation. Oh God, what if he's not French? I didn't look that up. We're going to roll it. René Descartes was a philosopher who talked a lot about the concepts of idealism, ideas, and existence, and translated and bastardized all the time, is this concept of his, which is, I think, therefore I am. Now, the basic concept was Descartes was battling with this idea of how do I know if what's actually here is actually here, if existence is actually existence. So very much like the Matrix, this concept of like, how do I know if the things that I'm seeing and experiencing are actually there, right? And to be true, to be fair, everything that you see and experience or whatever is filtered through a number of ways before it actually reaches your brain, which is where you can actually process it. Light coming into your eye, processed by cones, processed by nerves, etc. All sorts of stuff like that. But the point is that Descartes said that the way you can know that you exist is the fact that you are thinking about existing. And thinking, thought itself, having those thoughts is the proof of true existence for you. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, Konrad Curze has thoughts, like everybody else does, but his thoughts are real confusing.
Today would be the day. He knew it, as he knew all things. The answers came to him as they always did, in his dreams. Since mastering the world, he found his post-mortal senses sharpening beyond anything he'd imagined. He knew, on some voiceless level, he was becoming something. He was ripening, maturing into whatever he was born to be. It manifested first in knowing what people would say before they spoke, and soon became a habit of dreaming the events of most days on the nights before they happened. Soon enough, he was dreaming while awake. What would happen began to overlay his vision of what was happening. He'd speak to an underling, losing track of the man's voice, hearing instead the servant's last words when he was destined to die from a heart failure in 9 years. He'd see the faces of his governors, each one lined by years they'd not yet lived, carrying scars they hadn't yet earned.
That excerpt was from an absolutely amazing story called The Prince of Crows. If you have not read that story before or done the audiobook, you need to do it immediately. It's one of my favorite short stories. I think it might be the best short story in the Horus Heresy. But anyway, the point is, it's a story from that moment is a perspective of Konrad Curze, and he's remembering the moment that the emperor actually descended upon Nostromo. And this is after Curze has, through terror, captivated the entire audience, the entire environment of Nostromo, and taken over everything. Okay, he knows that the emperor is going to come down because of his visions, whatever, which have been accelerating, which while they used to be things that he dreamed before and then became true, he's reaching a point where he is seeing things in the future as they are happening. And this very clear moment where, he's having these dream state ideas where he is dreaming something and seeing it at the same time, which, that of course would be extremely traumatic as for trying to figure out what is actually occurring. How do I know which is my vision and which is real? So Curze thinks these things. He has these thoughts and these visions while he is also having these visions of the future. Throughout all of his time, throughout all of his existence, these things have been overlapping, and a body of evidence has been building for him to be able to say or imagine to himself, this is true, this is real, and the things that I imagine are going to come to fruition. Since so much of what the Primarchs are, it's really nebulous as to how much is really designed, how much is really the Emperor putting things in there, and how much is the choice or the input or whatever else. It's not even really certain just how random the placement of the Primarchs on their different planets was. There are times in other stories, for example, a greater demon tells the Great Khan of the White Scars that he was actually supposed to go to Chemos, and Fulgrim was supposed to go to Chagoris. I think that's a demon of, I can't remember if it's Slaanesh or Tzeentch, but it doesn't really matter. Why would you trust it? The point is, though, that there is a lot of concept to make us think that, we don't necessarily know how much even is random about the Primarchs, what they became, how they chose to do what they do. It's also really interesting that all of the Primarchs, they meet their father, they meet the Emperor, and they just all choose to follow him. Some of that, a lot of that, and there's a lot of other backstory to suggest that the Emperor psychically manipulates them to make that happen, thus, again, taking away their agency or their ability to do those things. But regardless, it just makes things even more complicated when we begin to talk about Curze and his crimes. However, I believe we can take two things as fact from that quote, at least from understanding what Curze himself believes. One, he definitely believes that there is a destiny in mind for him. And two, he believes that his visions are leading him towards the truth of that destiny and that destination. Now, I'm not as versed in philosophy as I would like to be, and I'm kind of having a hard time. I'm struggling finding a way to say this, but I'm going to offer this up as a way of a conclusion going forward. I believe that Curze believes those things to be true. He believes that he is supposed to be this way. And he believes that the Emperor wants him to be this way. I think we can draw that conclusion. And I think we can also see how that might lead to some problems going forward. Now, the next term that we're going to introduce here is utilitarianism. And this is pretty essential to understanding Curze's defense of himself. Utilitarianism is a philosophy that says, basically, the way you determine what something, if something is moral, is if your action provides the most overall happiness in the universe, then it is a moral act. And it is less about what you do to achieve that goal or accomplish that goal than it is the end result, okay? Now, the reason I bring this up or point this out is because of not only that Curze has these visions, seeing what he is supposed to become. He knows that he was created by the Emperor for a specific task. He meets his legion brought to him by the Emperor and sees that his legion is aligned with the things that Curze himself has already done. And so he has every reason to believe that this is the path that the Emperor has set out for him. And during the process of the Great Crusade, as it continues on, Curze follows this path, and he does a remarkable job. The Night Lords are known to be, actually, on a just pure numbers level, they are supposed to have a lower casualty rate for the planets that they compel to join the Imperium, because the part of the way that they subdue those populaces is by making a rather gruesome example of those who would stand against them. And therefore, they show everyone else it's much better to listen to us than not. There's stories, it's been put in the fluff, different places, that systems would just readily submit and undo their war footing after hearing that the Night Lords were on their way, just because of the reputation for debauchery and awfulness that came with them. Now, these actions, this concept of the Night Lords as a retributive force, as someone who goes in, sometimes even for people who were loyal at one point and try to backslide, they are made to, or they're set to be made an example of by the Night Lords through that cruelty. And they are cruel. They are not good guys. The acts that they are committing under any other sort of philosophical system would be unforgivable. There's just no other word for it. They do terrible things. They torture their victims. You just have to look at the armor, the models. GW is not being shy about this. Utilitarianism is the sort of philosophy that makes sense because, or it makes sense to those who follow it, because they basically say that committing acts and taking evil onto yourself in order to provide better good for other people is a sacrifice worth making. Now, I think a lot of times when people talk about utilitarianism in our world, in reality, and they try to imagine that they are utilitarianists, oftentimes, in my experience, those people, as soon as the hardship of utilitarianism is thrust upon them, they would shy away from a philosophy like that. We came up with an example in one of my classes once where we were talking about trying to figure out utilitarianism. So imagine you have 6 kids and each of them has 7 cookies. There is one student who only has 1 cookie. And so we had this idea that, like, utilitarianisms, they would undergo some discomfort in order to provide the best possible happiness for everyone. So we offered this theory, this experiment. Well, if the 6 all give up 1 cookie so that the student with the least amount can have the most happiness possible, which is more cookies, then there is a lot more fair distribution of cookies. However, the one who had least suddenly becomes the one with the most. and that last student ends up with 7 while everyone else only has 6. Now, is there really a lot of difference between 6 cookies and 7 cookies? No. But I think in reality, a lot of people would have a real hard time doing something like that. A lot of us don't have that kindness in our hearts. What's interesting to me is that Konrad Curze definitely doesn't have that kind of kindness in his heart, but that's overcome by something kind of special and important, which is that he hates himself. Now, not only did Konrad Curze hate himself, but he also hated his legion. There was this idea of this legion when they first arrived. If they could have stayed true philosophers to their utilitarian beliefs and maybe stuck with it all the way and truly sacrificed as much as they could have, then perhaps this could have worked. It wouldn't have, but maybe it could have. However, things fell apart really quickly, and in the story, after Konrad Curze leaves Nostromo, his subsequent recruits that he's getting from Nostromo, instead of being the brightest, the strongest, the best, the most morally sound, the ones who are, intellectually and physically capable of shouldering such a heavy philosophical burden, those people aren't going to be Space Marines. Instead, they get the dregs. They get the absolute worst. They get degenerates. And instead of being about the high, lofty, probably unreachable philosophical goal, instead you get these murderers and killers and whatever else, and you just give them superpowers. And they, believe it or not, that turns out to be a recipe for disaster. There's a fantastic quote from his Primarch book as well, in which Corax actually watches Curze, or comes across Curze murdering a whole bunch of Night Lord soldiers. And basically Konrad Curze says that he does it because they were awful. They were degenerates. They enjoyed inflicting pain. They deserved punishment, and they deserved death for those things. So he kills his own troops because he knows that the people he has coming out of Nostromo are worthless. They're amoral monsters. This, of course, leads to Konrad Curze ending up going back home and destroying his own planet, which he again sees as a form of punishment because they have betrayed him, as opposed to just trying to fix things, social help programs, work study. No, that's not Konrad Curze's way. Blow it up from the sky. There's also another fantastic quote that comes from, well, there's a lot of moments that are great in the Primarch book, but there is a moment when Konrad Curze, who is definitely sane and not at all crazy, is talking to a sculpture of meat that he made out of servants in the form of the Emperor, and he imagines that it's come to life and is talking to him. I'm not saying he's sane, right? I'm not saying he is making the right choices. I'm just saying he thinks these things, right? Anyway, Konrad Curze goes on this rant to the Emperor where he talks about, and again explores this concept of utilitarianism in reference to this punishment that he has coming for the crimes that he has committed. But he turns it right back around to the Emperor and says, "What about you, Dad?"
You weren't so clever after all. Look at us now. You are dead, whereas I, the unloved, hideous, wicked Konrad Curze, live. I will die before this night is out, in the manner that was ordained. Did you have that? Did you have my certainty? Or did you cling to belief in your freedom of will and choice to let Horus gut you? He laughed bleakly. Did you see that coming, O great and marvelous Emperor? His mirth sank like blood into sand. Did you, I wonder? Could you see all the ends of my brothers as I did? Did you see Dorn torn to pieces, Sanguinius cut down, the Gorgon beheaded by his most beloved brother? If you did, you are a far worse monster than I.
So is Konrad Curze a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Or is he a bad guy with a bad dad guy? It's a very stupid title. How do we get around the entanglement or the problems of this free will versus determinism? How do we factor in this concept of these visions that he has and what he thinks and what he perceives and what is real around it? Well, there was another philosopher who actually came up with something to provide another framework that we might consider. And his name is Harry Frankfurt. That's his name. Harry Frankfurt. So the so-called Frankfurt cases are counterexamples which basically set up an idea of basically this dilemma between free will and determinism, whether you have a choice or you don't have a choice. So let's say, for example, that Konrad Curze was in a situation where he was being told to torture someone for littering on the street. And he gets to the point, he grabs the person, and it's time to make the choice. Now, if he decided to not do so and to let the person go, then the Emperor's psychic programming jumps in and forces him to complete the act as well. And against his will, he ends up doing the thing, doing the bad thing, okay? Well, that is clearly a situation of Konrad Curze not being able to control himself, not being able to do what he wanted to do. Now, what if he comes to a position where he has the ability to torture that litter bug, and he simply does it? He simply acts. The Frankfurt cases, the counterexamples, suggest this idea that just because you wouldn't have been able to do it doesn't mean that choosing to do it becomes a moral act. Konrad Curze still chooses to do all the things that he does, even though it might be compelled or strongly suggested towards or pushed towards those different ideas and visions. I definitely think that there is some truth to this idea that I don't know what the Emperor expects, or the fact that they have to execute the Night Haunter in this way is definitely an embarrassment, an indictment on the great plan of the Great Crusade, horrible planning altogether, but that's a time for another video. However, it is pretty amazing to me that out of such humble beginnings of just a pretty simple sort of satire, we can have such really interesting concepts and characters come to life in this story.
So it's like early Monday morning as I record this chunk. I stopped editing the video at like midnight and I went to bed, and I tossed and turned, and it's like, what time is it? Like 4 a.m. I don't know. I woke up and I was thinking about this for some reason or other. I knew I wasn't satisfied with the ending. So let's see if the delirium of sleeplessness brings me closer to Konrad Curze so I can make my final point. The way I see it, and this is going to be the sprawling dichotomy of this series going forward, is that I essentially see two ways to look at Curze. The first is that he is just and this is true. He is an abject villain. He does bad things, unquestionably bad things. Things that are not even like there's no subjectivity to it. He commits terrible crimes. He does bad things, and that his actions determine and make him a monster. The thing that is complicated, though, within the story is the Emperor's role in all of it and how the whole thing fits together. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important to understand that the setting is satirical, that it's meant to be extra dark, extra bad, extra awful. It's meant to lampoon, a number of things. So even as this video progressed and I began talking about Konrad Curze and his choices and the things that were done to him, the things that happened because of him, whatever, as I'm putting this video together, I'm creating doubt for the idea that here's the cat. Creating doubt for the idea that Curze is responsible for some of his own choices, but he is responsible for his own choices. The big complication, and this gets back to something that I talked about in the opening video for this whole segment, is the fact that there are no good guys in Warhammer. And Konrad Curze is definitely not a good guy. And even if it is true that he is entirely manipulated, set out to exist in this way by the Emperor, even if he's entirely set up for it, and even if we think about it and find the Emperor to be largely at fault for everything, honestly, that happens to the Horus Heresy, which, spoiler alert, I do, he's still villainous, he's still awful. And for our position, he is He is not a kind of thing, creature, identity, whatever that we would ever want to see exists in our world. And for that, we can just cleanly and simply call him evil, because it's true. It's what he is. Still fun to think about. Still fun to play on the tabletop, though. Anyway, back to your regularly scheduled program.
Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. It would be really, really awesome if you would like and subscribe and consider donating to the channel. This type of video takes a lot more time to research and put together. So I would really appreciate your support in any way that you can find possible. All right? Thanks so much. Take care.